wind moves first. It slides across open ground and lifts the dust into slow, spiraling columns, as if the earth itself is breathing. Somewhere in that dust stands a woman where armies are meant to stand. Not behind them, not beside them, at the place where command becomes fate. Her presence bends the space around her. Sound thins. Time seems to hesitate. The weight of decision settles like iron in the air. She is remembered, if she is remembered at all, as a name. A shadow pressed faintly into the margins of history. And yet everything about her posture speaks of command, of lives ordered, of borders redrawn, of fear and loyalty woven together into something unbreakable. This is the contradiction that opens her story. Immense power paired with near silence. A figure capable of shaping the destiny of thousands, nearly erased as if she had never existed at all. History is often loud about its conquerors. It celebrates their monuments, repeats their names until they harden into legend. But some stories are quieter, not because they were small, but because the world that inherited them chose not to listen. The question is not whether this woman mattered. The question is how someone who mattered so completely could be pushed to the edge of memory. How does a life that once moved the ground beneath it fade into rumor and omission? You can almost hear the echoes if you listen closely. The low rhythm of drums carried on the night air. The thud of hooves striking packed earth. The murmur of a city at rest, protected by unseen hands. These sounds linger long after the voices that commanded them have gone. They ask something of us. They ask us to look again, to listen harder, to accept that the past is larger and more complex than the version we were taught to inherit. To understand her rise, we must return to a world very different from our own. Before maps were drained of color and simplified into borders drawn by distant powers, this land was defined by motion. Trade did not merely pass through it. Trade shaped it. Routes stretched like arteries across the landscape, carrying goods, ideas, beliefs, and ambitions from one horizon to another. Wealth moved on the backs of animals and the shoulders of people, measured not only in objects but in influence. Where those routes converged, power gathered. This was not a fragile world. It was a world sharpened by competition. Cities rose because they could defend themselves. Leaders endured because they understood that authority was not a gift. It was a responsibility enforced daily by strength, foresight, and negotiation. Survival demanded intelligence. Prosperity demanded strategy. Nothing stayed still for long. Markets pulsed with noise and color, with voices bargaining and stories traveling faster than any messenger. Horses were prized not for beauty, but for speed and endurance. Metal rang against stone. Knowledge was currency. Faith shaped law. Law shaped order. Every decision rippled outward, touching trade, security, and honor all at once. In this world, leadership was not inherited like a crown resting on velvet. It was seized, tested, and defended. A ruler who could not protect the flow of life through their domain did not rule for long. Civilization here was not an accident. It was built deliberately, maintained fiercely, and challenged constantly. It is tempting from a distance of centuries to imagine the past as simpler. But simplicity is a luxury of hindsight. Those who lived within this world knew how thin the line was between prosperity and ruin. They knew that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the successful management of it. They understood that power was always provisional, always under negotiation with rivals seen and unseen. Within such a landscape, stories of greatness were never guaranteed to endure. They had to be carried forward by memory, by tradition, by the stubborn persistence of physical traces left behind. Without that, even the most formidable lives could slip quietly into obscurity. And within this world, shaped by movement and survival, a child is born into a household already heavy with expectation. Her earliest years are not framed by innocence, but by preparation. She grows surrounded by symbols of authority and the unspoken understanding that position alone is never enough. Around her, adults speak in the language of alliances and risks, of loyalty earned and lost. She watches decisions ripple outward and sees how quickly strength is tested. The future is not a distant abstraction here. It presses close, demanding readiness. What is expected of her is never stated outright, because it does not need to be. Tradition does that work quietly, efficiently. It outlines the paths deemed acceptable, the roles meant to be fulfilled, the spaces where ambition is permitted and where it is not. For many, this is enough. The shape of life is laid out in advance, and the task is simply to move within it. But there is something restless in her attention, a sense that the boundaries placed before her are not fixed lines but suggestions. She listens carefully, not just to what is said, but to what is assumed. And in those assumptions, she begins to see the limits others have accepted without question. Leadership, she learns early, is not a title. It is a craft. It is built from discipline, from understanding people as much as terrain, from the ability to stand alone when consensus dissolves. It is learned the way any difficult language is learned, through repetition, error, and relentless focus. No one hands it to you. You take it piece by piece. There's isolation in this awareness. To see beyond the role assigned to you is to step outside the comfort of belonging. Curiosity becomes a quiet form of rebellion. Questions form where answers are not expected. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, refusal takes shape. Not loud, not dramatic, just firm. She does not reject her world. She studies it. She does not deny its rules. She measures them. What she resists is the idea that destiny is fixed, that capability is determined before it is ever tested. She senses, even before she has the words for it, that power responds to those who understand its mechanics, not those who simply inherit its symbols. This hunger for agency is not gentle. It sharpens her focus. It pulls her attention outward, toward the systems that actually move the world she inhabits, toward the structures that decide who is protected and who is exposed, toward the forces that reward strength and punish hesitation. Refusal alone is not power. Power must be built, and so her attention shifts from observation to action, from watching decisions to learning how they are made, from the safety of expectation to the risk of proving herself in a world that does not readily make space for those who challenge its assumptions. The quiet defiance of her early years begins to transform into something more demanding, more dangerous. The ground beneath her feet has always been contested. Now she prepares to step fully into that contest, to learn the language spoken where survival and authority meet. The world that forged her is about to test whether she can shape it in return. The language of war is not learned all at once. It is absorbed slowly, through repetition, through failure, through the steady erosion of fear. At first, it is sound before meaning, the scrape of metal, the thud of impact, the rhythm of breath forced to match movement. The body learns before the mind understands. Muscles memorize patterns long before strategy takes shape. What begins as imitation hardens into instinct. Training is not a single moment, but a cycle. Dawn after dawn, dust settling into skin, sweat darkening fabric. The same motions repeated until they no longer feel chosen. War, she discovers, is not chaos. It is structure disguised as violence. It has grammar and rules, rhythms and pauses. Every movement has a consequence. Every hesitation is read by those watching. Pain becomes a teacher. It strips away illusion quickly. There is no romance here, no glory in exhaustion or injury. There is only the clarity that comes when effort reveals its cost. Respect is not offered. It is extracted through endurance. Those who last earn space. Those who excel command attention. She learns that strength alone is insufficient. Power is coordination, knowing when to push and when to wait, when to advance and when to hold. War is calculation as much as courage. It is the ability to read the ground beneath your feet, the people beside you, and the intentions of those who would see you fall. It is mathematics written in movement. The tempo quickens. Training becomes application. Preparation spills into action, not as grand campaigns, but as fragments of conflict, moments where theory is tested against reality. She watches how fear spreads faster than fire, how discipline contains it, how loyalty is not demanded but cultivated, earned through consistency and shared risk. Leadership reveals itself not in command, but in presence. There's a moment, subtle but irreversible, when observation ends. She is no longer watching from the edge. She is within it, carrying responsibility with each decision. Others begin to look to her, not because they are told to, but because confidence has a gravity of its own. Authority accumulates quietly, often unnoticed until it is already established. Skill alone, however, does not change history. Power must be recognized. Recognition is rarely granted willingly. It is negotiated, resisted, and often resented. Tradition does not surrender easily. It is defended by habit, by expectation, by the comfort of familiarity. Leadership that arrives without permission unsettles the balance of belief. It forces a reckoning between what has always been done and what is now undeniably effective. Her growing authority becomes visible, too visible. Success attracts scrutiny. What was once tolerated as exception begins to feel like threat. The structures that govern legitimacy, the alliances of influence, the weight of custom, the unspoken rules of succession, press in. Power, she learns, is not held in isolation. It exists at the intersection of belief systems, elite interests, and the loyalty of those who enforce decisions when words fail. The cost of refusal becomes clear. There are expectations that bind more tightly than chains, rituals meant to absorb ambition and redirect it into acceptable forms. To decline them is to invite suspicion. Isolation follows visibility. The higher one rises, the fewer peers remain. Authority narrows the circle until leadership becomes a solitary position. And yet belief shifts when reality insists. Those who once doubted begin to calculate. Effectiveness erodes resistance. Success reframes defiance as inevitability. Power, when sustained long enough, changes how it is perceived. What begins as anomaly transforms into precedent. Authority is a performance sustained by belief. Once belief shifts, structures follow. The moment arrives quietly, without ceremony. Preparation meets history not as spectacle, but as consequence. The accumulated weight of discipline, loyalty, and strategic clarity crystallizes into something irreversible. Leadership becomes uncontested not because opposition disappears, but because it no longer makes sense. Momentum gathers. Decisions ripple outward with increasing speed. Where hesitation once lived, confidence now moves freely. Expansion is no longer framed as ambition, but as necessity. Order imposed where instability threatens survival. Strategy stretches beyond immediate control toward permanence. Power begins to think in terms of endurance. Symbols emerge, not in declarations, but in actions repeated until they define expectation. Boundaries marked, routes secured, systems reinforced. The idea of permanence takes shape not through conquest alone, but through consolidation. control becomes visible in what remains standing, in what continues to function even in absence. Success carries its own intoxication. The rhythm of ascent is seductive. Each resolved challenge feeds the sense that momentum itself is a force to be harnessed. Earlier struggles echo now as proof rather than doubt. The path that once required resistance now clears underfoot. But elevation casts shadows. The higher power climbs, the more resistance gathers below. Stability achieved invites envy. Order imposed generates opposition. Every structure built to last becomes something others wish to dismantle. Time enters the equation as quietly as belief once did. Not as an enemy, but as a presence. Victories accumulate. Authority solidifies. And yet beneath it all runs an unspoken understanding. No command is permanent. No leader stands outside mortality. Conquest may redraw boundaries, but it does not halt the passage that waits for all. The question changes. It is no longer whether power can be seized or defended. It becomes whether it can outlast the hand that holds it. Whether structures built under one can endure beyond a single life. Whether legacy is measured in territory, in systems, or in memory itself. The weight of this realization settles slowly, not as fear, but as clarity. The final opponent is not another force, not another challenger, but the quiet certainty that time will demand its due. What survives when the voice that commanded armies falls silent? That silence, when it comes, does not arrive all at once. It spreads outward, leaving behind redistribution and adjustment rather than collapse. Power shifts. Some things fracture, others hold. Survival reveals itself not as stagnation, but as transformation. History does not end when rulers die. What follows is never as dramatic as ascent, yet it is more revealing. Structures are tested. Belief reorients. The absence of a singular presence forces institutions to prove their worth. What was built to last either does or does not. Continuity becomes success. Endurance replaces expansion as the measure of achievement. The difference between collapse and transformation is found in what remains functional when ambition has spent itself. And beyond the immediate aftermath, memory begins its work. Not the memory of events, but the memory of meaning. Stories persist where records fade. Symbols endure where names blur. The past reshapes itself through what is chosen to be remembered and what is allowed to slip away. History is not an archive. It is a negotiation between evidence and narrative, between power and silence, between what was built and what was told about it. Her story still matters because it forces a reckoning with those negotiations. It challenges the comfort of a single story, the assumption that greatness follows predictable paths or familiar faces. It reminds us that absence from memory does not equal absence from reality. Representation is not decoration. It is permission to imagine differently, to recognize that power has always taken many forms, in many places, long before it was selectively recorded. To understand that erasure is not proof of insignificance, but often evidence of discomfort. This is not a story confined to a single region or time. It is a human story, about agency claimed, about systems built under pressure, about the cost of refusing limits imposed by expectation. It ends not with instruction, but with invitation. To question what we have been taught, to revisit the margins, to listen for the echoes still carried by wind across ground shaped by decisions made long ago. Because history is not finished with us, and neither are the stories we choose to recover. Silence has weight. It settles differently than noise ever did. When the voice that once shaped outcomes no longer fills the space, what remains is not emptiness, but exposure. Every structure, every agreement, Every habit forged under command must now stand on its own. This is the moment that reveals whether power was merely personal or truly transformed into something larger. The immediate aftermath is not chaos. It is adjustment. Authority does not vanish, it redistributes. Some hands reach too quickly, mistaking absence for opportunity. Others hesitate, waiting to see which way belief will tilt. Loyalties recalibrate. What was once unified by presence must now be held together by design. There are fractures. That is inevitable. Distant edges strain first, testing the limits of cohesion. Some bonds loosen, some break entirely. This is not failure. It is gravity asserting itself. Expansion always carries a cost, and when the force that sustained it recedes, what remains contracts toward what is strongest. Yet the center holds. It holds because endurance was never left to chance. Because permanence was considered alongside conquest. Because systems were built not just to serve a ruler, but to outlast one. Structures continue to function. Routes remain protected. Order persists where disorder once waited. The transformation from ambition to continuity reveals its quiet success. This is the difference between collapse and survival. Collapse is loud, immediate, unmistakable. Survival is subtle. It appears as persistence, as adaptation, as the refusal of everything to unravel simply because a single figure is gone. In time, the urgency fades. New leaders emerge, shaped by the culture they inherit rather than the force that created it. They do not replicate the past. They reinterpret it. What remains constant is the framework within which they operate. The emphasis on durability, the expectation of competence, the understanding that authority must justify itself continuously. The world moves on, as it always does. Trade flows shift. Alliances evolve. The landscape absorbs the passage of years without ceremony. But memory works differently. It is not bound to chronology. It collects meaning, discards detail, reshapes reality into something that can be carried forward. Stories begin to travel where records fall silent. They change as they move, bending to the needs of those who tell them. Some elements grow larger than life. Others fade into suggestion. What survives is not precision, but essence. The sense of a presence that once altered the balance of things. This is how legacies persist, not as exact replicas of truth, but as impressions powerful enough to endure distortion. The danger lies not in myth itself, but in dismissal. When myth is used as an excuse to erase rather than investigate. When uncertainty becomes justification for neglect. History has never been neutral. It is shaped by those with the means to record it, to preserve it, to repeat it until repetition hardens into authority. Entire civilizations have been compressed into footnotes because their stories were not written in the languages that came to dominate archives. Entire lives have been minimized because they disrupted expectations about who power was meant to belong to. The absence of story does not mean the absence of impact. It often means the opposite. This is why the question of remembrance matters, not as sentiment, but as responsibility. What we choose to recover reshapes our understanding of what has always been possible. What we ignore reinforces limits that were never inherent, only imposed. Her story endures because it resists easy categorization. It refuses to fit neatly into narratives that divide history into familiar centers and peripheral margins. It complicates assumptions about leadership, about gender, about where innovation and authority emerge. It reminds us that the past was not waiting to become the present. It was full in its own right, complex, competitive, intellectually alive. The people who lived within it did not see themselves as precursors to something greater. They saw themselves as actors in a world that demanded intelligence and resolve. To acknowledge this is to challenge a deeply ingrained habit of simplification. It is easier to imagine history as a narrow procession of inevitabilities than as a vast landscape of parallel possibilities. But ease has never been a reliable guide to truth. The persistence of her legacy offers a different lesson, one that speaks quietly rather than commanding attention. It suggests that power rooted in systems, in continuity, in shared belief, can outlive even the most commanding individuals. That leadership measured only by conquest is fleeting, while leadership invested in endurance leaves marks that time struggles to erase. There's also a more intimate resonance, a reminder that resistance does not always announce itself loudly. That refusal can be patient. That preparation often looks like obscurity until the moment it becomes undeniable. That capability does not require permission to exist, only opportunity to be demonstrated. For those who listen to history searching for mirrors rather than monuments, this story offers something rare. Not an idealized figure untouched by consequence, but a human trajectory shaped by choice, discipline, and an unrelenting awareness of reality. Greatness here is not accidental. It is constructed. The danger of a single story is not that it is false, but that it is incomplete. When history narrows its focus too tightly, it trains imagination to expect greatness from only certain directions. It teaches absence as inevitability rather than omission. It limits the range of what can be envisioned. Recovering stories like this expands that range. It does not require mythologizing. It requires attention, the willingness to sit with ambiguity, to accept that evidence can be fragmented and still meaningful, to understand that continuity of impact matters as much as continuity of record. Quiet inspiration lingers long after spectacle fades. It does not demand admiration. It invites reflection. It reframes assumptions without confrontation. It leaves behind a sense of awe, not at domination, but at possibility. The past, when approached honestly, does not tell us what to think. It asks us what we are willing to reconsider. And so the story moves forward, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, an invitation to look again at the margins, to question inherited narratives, to recognize that history is not something finished and sealed, but something still unfolding in the act of remembrance. What we choose to carry forward shapes what comes next. There's a place where Earth still holds the memory of pressure, where wind traces paths along curves shaped by human intent long ago, where stones and soil, rearranged by hands that understood endurance, continue to interrupt the present with reminders of a different order of time. You can stand there today and feel it, not as spectacle, but as persistence, proof that some decisions were made with centuries in mind. This is where the story finally resolves itself, not in the certainty of dates or the precision of records, but in what remains when everything else has thinned. Long after banners have rotted and names have slipped from common speech, structure endures. Systems outlast ambition. Foundations outlive the hands that laid them. The temptation, when telling stories like this, is to search for final judgment, to ask whether the life was justified, whether the cost was too high, whether the outcome was worth the means. But history resists verdicts. It offers instead a field of consequences, layered and uneven, where achievement and damage coexist without canceling one another. What matters, in the end, is not purity but impact. A single life does not change the world by existing. It does so by altering what comes after, by shifting what is considered possible, by forcing structures to adapt, by leaving behind arrangements that others must now respond to, whether they admire them or not. This is the deeper legacy, Not the battles themselves, but the recalibration of expectation. The quiet but irreversible proof that leadership is not bound to one shape, one gender, one familiar narrative. That authority, when grounded in competence and sustained by systems, does not require constant reaffirmation through spectacle. It simply works. Centuries pass. Languages change. Powers rise and fall. The world reorganizes itself again and again, often violently, often unjustly. New histories are written, usually by those who benefit most from forgetting the old ones. And yet some stories refuse to disappear entirely. They survive in fragments, in names spoken without full explanation, in structures whose origins invite questions that never quite go away. Rediscovery is rarely dramatic. It happens through patience, through comparison, through the slow accumulation of evidence and the willingness to treat oral memory as something other than fiction. It happens when scholars begin to ask why certain absences exist and what those absences reveal about the values of the record keepers themselves. When that process begins, the past does not suddenly become clear. It becomes complicated. Myth and history overlap. Certainty dissolves into probability. And yet, paradoxically, the truth becomes stronger, not weaker, because it no longer depends on perfection. It rests instead on convergence, on the consistency of impact across time. What emerges is not a legend untouched by reality, but something more compelling. A human story shaped by constraint and choice, by preparation and refusal, by the relentless logic of a world that rewarded those who understood it deeply enough to work within its rules while quietly rewriting them. This is why the story still matters now. Not because the world today resembles the world then. It is not, but because the patterns remain familiar. Power still resists those who do not resemble its predecessors. History is still curated by those with access to platforms and permanence. Capability is still too often mistaken for anomaly when it appears outside expected frames. Representation is not about celebration. It is about accuracy, about restoring proportion to our understanding of what has always existed, about dismantling the illusion that greatness is rare in certain places or among certain people, when in reality, it has simply been selectively recorded. When we widen the lens, the past becomes less comforting but more honest. It reveals a world where many paths were possible, not just the ones that led to the present we inhabit. It shows us that what eventually dominated was not inevitable, only successful under particular conditions. It reminds us that alternative centers of power, knowledge, and organization once flourished and could have continued to do so under different circumstances. This understanding changes how we see ourselves. It loosens the grip of inherited limitation. It replaces inevitability with contingency. It invites humility, not because the past was primitive, but because it was complex in ways we are still learning to recognize. There is also a quieter lesson embedded here, one that does not announce itself. The reminder that endurance is not glamorous, that building something capable of surviving you requires restraint as much as ambition, that the most lasting forms of power are often the least dramatic in their daily operation. Walls do not conquer, roads do not command, systems do not inspire loyalty on their own. And yet, without them, conquest collapses into memory almost immediately. What endures is what continues to function when attention moves elsewhere. This is not a story about invincibility. It is a story about limits acknowledged and worked with rather than denied. About mortality accepted not as defeat, but as a design constraint. About leadership that understands its own impermanence and builds accordingly. If there is inspiration here, it is not found in domination, but in discipline. Not in exceptionality, but in preparation. Not in spectacle, but in persistence. History, when approached this way, becomes less about admiration and more about orientation. It helps us see where we stand within longer arcs of cause and consequence. It reminds us that the present is not the pinnacle of progress, but one configuration among many, shaped by choices that could have gone otherwise. Standing at the edge of what remains, you're not asked to agree with every action taken or to excuse every cost incurred. You are asked instead to acknowledge reality in its full dimension, to accept that human potential has always exceeded the boundaries imposed upon it, to recognize that what was possible once remains possible again, under different names, in different forms. The story does not demand belief. It invites attention. Attention to the margins. Attention to the structures beneath the surface. Attention to the quiet persistence of things built with intention. Attention to the way memory itself is shaped by power and the responsibility that comes with reshaping it. Because history is not a closed book. It is an ongoing negotiation between past and present. Every time a story is told differently, the future adjusts slightly in response. This is why the name matters. Not as an icon, but as a correction. A reminder that the world has always been wider than the versions we inherit. That greatness has never belonged exclusively to those who were most successful at recording it. And so the story ends where it began. Not with certainty, but with presence. With the sense that something real once stood where others said nothing stood at all. With the understanding that absence in history often marks not insignificance, but resistance to erasure. What we do with that understanding is now up to us.